Hi everyone, welcome to our video series on studying audits. I'm Dr. Nelson Ma from the University of Technology, Sydney.
And I'm Dr. Rebecca Bachmann from Macquarie University.
And so today we're going to be talking about 5 tips that you can use in preparing and completing your audit exam. So the first tip is don't over-rely on the subject materials. That means prepare your own notes. Don't just rely on the textbooks and lecture slides. Although both of our exams are open book, it's probably a little too common for students to just expect that they can just use those lecture slides and the textbook to do the exam. An exam is practical, so you won't be asked to explain concepts like the audit risk model. Instead, you'll be asked to maybe identify inherent risks or identify control weaknesses. So on that basis, you don't want notes about the audit risk model and the different components. And what you really want is notes that give you examples of what inherent risks are, what the different control weaknesses are, so that you can hopefully identify that in the question or case to answer.
Another key issue that we often see when students rely too much on the slides or lecture materials is that there is a tendency to just take the example that's given or a potential solution to an identified risk and just put that in the exam. But the problem is the exam question obviously is a completely different scenario. So the answer that has been provided in a lecture example will not automatically fit the one provided in the exam.
Absolutely. It's way too common to see a generic answer to what is a specific question.
Our second recommendation is don't over allocate time. So you would be well aware that you have a very limited amount of time to get through your whole exam. And looking at the marks that are indicated next to each individual question can help you figure out how much time you should allocate to the different components. If a question is worth 20 marks, whereas another question might be worth 10 marks, then it's probably a good indication that you should spend a lot more time on the 20-mark question rather than the much smaller one. And because you can navigate back and forth throughout your exam, if you get completely stuck on one question, take a second and then move on to a new question. And then if you have time left, go back to the other one. But don't get stuck on one question, move on.
Absolutely. And when we design questions, we design for them to be shorter than the time needed to do them. So, ideally, you try to finish the question in 70, 80% of the time that you need, and then, move on and then come back to it later on. Okay, so that brings us to tip 3, which is don't over-explain in your answers. All right, only answer the question that you've been given. So easy to over-explain and try to communicate to the marker every single thing that you know. Unfortunately, it doesn't help getting you extra marks when you talk about things that aren't relevant to the question. You want to be guided by how the question is written. So if you're being asked to identify a control weakness, you're probably going to get 1 point or 1 mark for just identifying the weakness, and that's all you need to do. Whereas if you're being asked to describe control weaknesses, and maybe you're given, say, 3 marks, you might have 1 mark to identify the weakness, a second mark to explain, well, what can go wrong as a result of this weakness, and the third mark, well, what is the account and assertion that become misstated.
Our fourth recommendation is don't overthink it. If it sounds easy, it usually is exactly that easy. Now, in audit, we have learned that the different definitions or different topics that we speak about, they usually have smaller subcategories. So when we're talking about audit strategy, there are usually only 2 approaches to choose from. So we could take a controls-based approach, or we could take an approach that focuses more on substantive procedures. And that all comes down to our assessment of inherent and control risk. So as you're answering these questions, try to remember, okay, what is the key component of this topic, and then break it down like that.
And, often we'll also write questions that include information that isn't relevant. Feel free to just ignore it. Don't overthink when you see information that just doesn't sit within the case, and doesn't sit within the audit process that we've talked about in our classes. Last recommendation is don't stress. You've got this. You've been studying hard the whole session, and you'll be surprised as to how much you know about the audit process now.
What I always found was helpful is if you can sense that you're starting to panic a little bit, you're starting to feel the stress building up, take a moment, pause, take a deep breath, and try again, or move on to a different question and then come back, as we said. But yeah, as Nelson said, you got this.